We are slaying monsters.
Don't let the ghosts and the ghouls disturb you, darling.
I think that one of the problems with cryptids, when you're doing the reporting on the cryptids, is that a lot of times the investigators come in and they tend to look for the cryptid in reports throughout history of a place. And you know, you end up recontextualizing a lot of stuff. And that's kind of what we're talking about with the way John Green investigated the Sasquatch in this whole series. But, you know, it's the same thing that we're kind of seeing that we saw in the Unsolved Mysteries Mothman episode that just came out a couple of weeks ago. That, you know, these investigators came in and said, wow, we heard 1 or 2 reports of Mothman in Illinois, in the Chicago area. Now we're going to investigate. Wow, a lot of people in Chicago see strange birds in the sky. I wonder if they're all Mothman, which is the wrong way to go about any of this, this reporting and this investigating, you know? And that's why you end up with these 2 women. There's the older woman and I think her daughter, who were in the car and they were like, we just saw a flying humanoid, but it didn't have wings. And like, for some reason that's in the episode, even though that is clearly not Mothman, because one of the tenets of Mothman is that it has wings, you know?
Yeah, I think somebody has a rocket suit or something, or a rocket pack.
So there were all those reports last year or earlier this year, I can't remember, it must have been last year, about the dudes with rocket packs somewhere in South America. Or Central America?
I don't know where it was, but I remember the reports.
Yeah, that like they were flying around with rocket packs, and I'm like, that actually kind of makes sense. They were cartel, you know.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, I do.
Whoa.
Yeah, I think that they were cartel. Because, dude, cartel's fucking loaded, dude. Do you remember, what was the Netflix show about the cartel boss? Shit. What was the name of that show?
Not Narcos.
Narcos.
That's
Narcos.
Colombia,
He had the gigantic fucking mansion and shit.
Yeah,
like,
they do have the mansions.
You know, like they have so much money. If one of those dudes wanted a jetpack, they could get a jetpack. And I think that it's absolutely believable that they were doing that and flying around like that. Yeah.
I love that your assumption is that it has to be cartel.
No,
as if there's no one else that could be doing this.
Well, I mean, possibly, I guess. There is a lot of cartel activity in that area, though.
I mean, listen, that's a very nice way to deliver drugs. Oh, here's my drug dealer. He's flying up over the trees. Oh, here he is. Yeah.
Yeah, Amazon's over here taking notes like, oh, yeah, jetpacks.
Jetpack drugs. Yep, nothing to see here. Little drug drop. Oh, there he goes, flying away. Bye. It's very cute. Yeah. Well, I think those 2 women definitely saw a man with a jetpack.
I think so too.
And but to explain the other stuff, I mean, it's like you said, like connecting the dots after the fact, finding all this, fitting all the data in to fit your story is definitely a common thing. And I don't know. I think people see things. I definitely do. But I think a lot of people, when they see these things, they're scared. They don't expect red eyes on anything. And when they see red eyes, it's like, oh my God. And then you think about it and maybe it gets overblown in your memory. Maybe you did see 4 limbs.
Yeah.
When really it was just probably a heron with red eyes.
Could be. Yeah, or an owl. I mean, that's not to invoke the great Joe Nickel, but like Mothman, I think the vast majority of Mothman sightings, especially when they happen at night, are pretty clearly owls. Like we don't realize, unless you have been around owls, you don't realize how big they can be. I mean, a barred owl has a 6-foot wingspan. No, and
and this is the interesting thing. I consider myself to be pretty knowledgeable about birds. Yeah. At least in my area. Yeah. I didn't know they had that kind of wingspan.
They're gigantic.
So if you were going to interview me and say, and I would say, I'm a bird watcher, I know my birds. Right. But I saw something flying with a 6-foot wingspan. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not a bird.
If I was prone to believing things like that, maybe I would say that So I think people say, "Oh, I'm an expert. I know birds. I know wildlife and everything like that." Like, I mean, I know I'm not like the epitome of all bird knowledge. I mean, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm just one person giving an example, but
sure.
I think people definitely can make mistakes in the moment when they're scared. And
yeah. I mean, we absolutely can. And I mean, look at crime reporting. People have a real tendency to, we're just bad at it when the adrenaline is high. You're really bad at recognizing and those very specific details on things because you just panic, right? You go fight or flight, got to do something. And most of those people ran. And I mean, look, I would be fucking terrified too even if I knew it was an owl, if the owl was flying at me, that's some scary shit.
If I saw an owl sitting up in a tree branch looking down at me, I would probably get inside because I've seen the Staircase documentary and I know that woman was killed by an owl.
Which is not in the documentary.
No.
But yes.
Should have been, though.
Should have been. Yeah. I mean, we had screech owls, which are not even, I mean, we had little baby screech owls that were like maybe 8 inches high.
They were
not
cute. Big.
But when the, I guess, mother owl or the father owl that was sitting with them would look at you, it was weird. It was like ominous, the way they look. And I knew what I was looking at. So I can't imagine suddenly seeing these big eyes in a tree and then having it like spread wings that are as big as a person and fly at me.
Yes.
Like that's insane. It's really scary.
I think the other thing that kind of it frustrates me about the episodes like this, even though and we were talking about it, it's fun, whatever.
Yeah.
But I was like not excited to watch the episode because I was like, this is all just going to be witness accounts with no evidence.
Yeah.
And that's really boring to me because you could talk to anybody about anything and there's your witness account and boom, put that in a freaking show and there you go. Yeah. Anybody can say anything they freaking want.
I know. Yeah.
It's very anticlimactic and not based on anything, and it's just boring to me.
And then I got real excited because there was the dude who was riding his bike and wearing the GoPro.
Yeah.
And they were like building up how he had this GoPro and he saw something and I was like, oh my God, are we going to get an actual fucking photograph? We have no photographs of Mothman as far as I know. We're like, are we going to get a photograph of Mothman? And then they're like, yeah, that was a heron. And I'm like, God damn it.
Yeah.
Come on. Like,
I know.
Why do you even include this? It's obviously nothing.
Yeah, the one thing. I know. I was very frustrated too.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks to also take photos. Like, we're in the modern
people
era.
Get desperate. It's scary. It's scary shit.
I know, but the women that were in the car eating McDonald's and they go out because they both see something.
Yeah.
Like, you had time to grab your phone and take a photo.
Yes.
Even if it was a shitty flash photo, you could have done it. You weren't scared. You weren't too scared. You were brave enough to go up to it, like, and kind of look at it.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you want to bring your camera?
Your phone? So. You would.
Anyway,
think so.
Whatever. I hate these episodes because it's like you can literally just say whatever the fuck you want to say.
I know.
And there's your episode.
Yeah. This season of Unsolved Mysteries was a little.
I like the true crime ones a lot.
Yeah.
Those are always good.
They were good. The Jack the Ripper was interesting, although that also felt like a throwaway episode, and Mothman felt like a throwaway episode. So there were only like 3 actual Unsolved Mysteries episodes.
Well, unless they wanted to talk about the possible connection between H.H. Holmes and Rip the Ripper, that would have been a cool angle.
Which would have been interesting. We're getting
oh my God,
way off topic here.
Oh God,
but yes,
sorry.
Yes, they should have, because they didn't come at it with a new angle. I was kind of, at least the Mothman was a new angle. You were like, okay, I didn't know that they were seen in Chicago recently. That was news to me. So okay, interesting, but you don't come with anything new about Jack the Ripper. It's just kind of like, yeah, this happened. I'm like, yeah, I know that it happened. Okay,
yeah,
whatever. Anyway, introduce us.
Okay. This is a very frustrated Slaying Monsters. We got mad across the table.
Did you forget the name of the podcast?
I did. I did. I forgot the name of our podcast.
Oh my God.
I've had a rough day. I've had a rough 24 hours. I was sick yesterday.
This is our 57th episode.
Yeah, okay, so we got Matt across the table. At least I know that. I know your name.
57 episodes, yes.
I know your name.
Yeah.
And then I'm EJ. That's my name.
At least you remembered that one.
I did.
God.
And we're going to talk about Sasquatches again.
Yes, we are. This is a Prehistory of Sasquatch, Part 4. We're going to bring the prehistory to the, well, not modern, but we're going to bring it to the history, I guess. So
Okay.
this is all under the context of the Sasquatch eras. So this is the era that is going to lead all the way up to Patterson-Gimlin, the Patterson-Gimlin film, of course, the Sasquatch film that we all know and love. That is going to redefine Sasquatchery for the rest of time. And we are studying all of the mythology, the stories, the events that led to that fateful filming and the redefinition of Sasquatch as an animal rather than mythology, people. You know, up until this point, well, up until the point of the last episode, it had kind of been like a lost tribe, kind of human beings existing in nature, communicating with each other, having, you know, they just kind of have long hair, you know, but they're not animals. And then in the last episode, we talked about how Ruby Creek, to a certain extent, because we saw tracks for the first time, but really the William Rowe incident, who saw a female Sasquatch and called it an animal, and the tracks of the loggers that they saw were the things that were changing this into, no, this is a hairy beast, a creature, an animal, not a human being.
And that's where the name Bigfoot came along.
That is where the name Bigfoot came from. Exactly. Yes. So in our last episode, John Green, you remember him. He's the journalist for the tiny little British Columbia town of Harrison Hot Springs. He has essentially become a Sasquatch believer now. He ignores the reports that contradicted indigenous tales up until this point, and he insisted that his version of Sasquatch, this hairy giant ape, fit perfectly with the local lore. He used evidence from the Ruby Creek encounter, which had been proved to be a bear by a prominent Canadian biologist, as further support for the Sasquatch. And when the Washington State practical joker Ray Wallace showed off these big tracks that he made using a literal big foot, a big stamp that he was making in the sand, Green was positive that the monster he had joked about just a few years earlier was real and was stalking through the Pacific Northwest woods.
It's interesting because he didn't really care about what the most logical explanation would be in this situation.
What,
that it was likely a bear.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, or that it was a hoax with when we
Sure.
talk about the Bigfoot's footprints.
Yes.
And it gets me also thinking about, once again, the Unsolved Mysteries episode where the one researcher said, well, the herons are starting to move into Chicago more because their environment is becoming like smaller
Right.
and smaller, and
Yep,
they're getting
climate
pushed
change.
in.
They specifically name climate change.
Yes,
Yep.
and deforestation and bullshit like
Oh, yeah,
that,
yeah.
terrible stuff. And so all these people that are not used to seeing herons are now like freaking out.
Right.
These huge crazy ass birds in the middle of the urban area, like what the hell? So I think that we have a logical explanation, but what's interesting to me is what is the kind of person that does not go to that logical explanation but
Right.
goes to the more fantastical thing. And
Yeah.
that's what's always interesting to me, like why do you jump to those things?
Yeah.
Because I'm that kind of person.
You're the
That would-
logical person,
No,
or you're the
I'm
jumpy person?
I'm the jumpy person. So it takes more for me to get back into the logic.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. Well, part of the problem was that Ray Wallace, who was faking all these tracks, was also swearing that he wasn't. You know, he was leading John Green down this way. And I mean, you know, he was claiming that he was feeding them Frosted Flakes too. But for some reason, that kind of shit didn't peak on John Green's radar. He believed him. So I don't know. I don't know what makes up that type of mindset to do that. It's clear that John Green thought it was a joke, or at least a funny thing, a couple of years before this, literally like 2 or 3 years before this, when he wrote his joke article.
Yeah.
So I don't know what
Something
shifted
switched.
that, you know? I get the sense that it was just, once he started actually looking into it, he found so much reporting around it that he believed where there's smoke, there's fire. Mm-hmm. You know?
There has to be something
Yeah,
here.
there has to be something here because there's so much talking about it. I don't know.
Maybe.
Now, Wallace had been faking the tracks himself, partly because he found the whole thing so damn funny, right? He just thought it was hilarious. But also, I think partly because he wanted to protect his business. Remember, he came from the old stock of loggers, the kind that lived out in the woods for weeks and gambled on fistfights for fun. These guys, they're rough, they're rowdy, and they don't take shit from anybody. Wallace owned a construction company, and therefore lots of very expensive equipment. The kind of machines that he would need to keep his business running. If one of these camps was the subject of sabotage, Wallace stood to lose a lot of money, and possibly even his contracts. Now, the 1940s and 50s was a wild time for the timber industry. We're seeing the push and pull of new inventions butting heads with traditional techniques and the threat of redundancy. Remember, we talked briefly last time about how these guys had been doing everything by hand, but now we're starting to see mechanizations come in. Mm-hmm. Machines are starting to replace them. So you have like gas-powered chainsaws starting to show up, and they're capable of doing the work of like a dozen men, right? Suddenly, the guys who cut down the trees, called the fellers, they're seeing their work start to dry up. Now, simultaneously, the Cold War pushed new industries like metal, atomic weapons, and financial services. The timber industry was quickly outpaced by a changing job landscape, which in turn devalues their political interests. And so all of a sudden, the timber industry doesn't have the lobbying power that they used to. Now that is the kind of thing that you would use to say like, hey, no, let's keep our jobs. Let's try to keep these machines out of the industry. But they couldn't do that because they were losing their lobbying power to these other industries. As the bosses start to lose power, they, of course, drive their workers even harder using more cutthroat means. All of this is set against the very real prospect that the timber industry is about to become obsolete. Logging had been such a massive enterprise since the 1800s that it was actually threatening to diminish the Pacific Northwest forests at this time. Timber barons had already seen the bubble burst on the East Coast and the Central forests. Like literally as we were moving the timber industry, we overforested the Northeast, we moved it to the Midwest, we overforested the Midwest, and now we moved to the Pacific Northwest, and we were overforesting that too.
Well, I'm curious though, like why is it dying when the population is continuing to grow and there's still going to be a need for timber? Are we getting it from somewhere else now?
No, we're literally running out of trees.
Okay. And so we're building things with different material. We have to. Well,
we were starting to do that, yeah. But also like this whole Washington, Oregon, British Columbia to a certain extent, this whole area that was timber was being overforested in such a major way that we were not going to have the trees to support the industry, which meant that they were probably going to have to move like further north up the coast. And so you're displacing all of these fucking jobs.
Man.
So faced with the destruction that they themselves created, some timber companies shifted focus to conservation and reforestation.
Wow.
Yeah. Huh. Some of them did the right thing, basically. Damn. Now others started lobbying the federal government to open national parks to logging.
Oh, this sounds so familiar.
Yeah.
When Trump was in office, he did all that crap too. Oil drilling.
This has been a push and pull for decades, right?
Yeah.
That logging in the 50s and 60s was so disgustingly successful that by the late 1960s, experts were predicting a 30% decline in old growth forests, according to the Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest. 30% decline. While all this was happening, the region was also becoming very favorable to a new population of farmers. Do you know who this is?
Is this well, it's not wine, is it?
No.
Is it
further
weed?
North? It's weed.
So what year is this? What are we talking about?
This is like the 50s and 60s.
Okay, 50s and 60s, I get it. Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. So the thing is, this area, the Pacific Northwest, it's very remote and it's kind of perceived as being lawless. Like it's this huge empty, remote section of land. And so it was called the Emerald Triangle. And this area saw a huge influx of refugees from the hippie movement who wanted to start off-the-grid lifestyles there. And at the same time, the California motorcycle gangs staked their claim in the region too, using the land as hubs to run their off-the-books businesses, including drug cultivation and sales. So you have this massive population of cannabis growers in that region too. All of this unrest that's going on there at that time created a particularly tumultuous environment for the lumber industry. And I think further incentivized Ray Wallace to conjure up a monster stalking around his land. I believe his Sasquatch served as a protector of sorts, a monster that guarded his workers and machines against anyone who tried to sabotage his business.
Interesting. Yeah.
You let these stories get out there, right? That you're like, don't go to Wallace's. They got that big giant there that's been throwing machinery around.
Damn, and that's how it all kind of started, and it makes me think of the Sasquatch documentary because they use that same line to keep people away from the weed, right?
Oh yeah. Well, and then they would also, because I mean, there were like lawless motorcycle gangs there at the time and stuff. They would kill people as needed, I guess. And then they would blame it on the Sasquatch.
Yeah.
Or sometimes they just use that as an urban legend to be like, oh, I heard somebody died at the next farm over, got torn apart by some giant monster. That sort of thing.
Stay away from this area.
Exactly. Yep. Now, to John Green, all of these sightings were indicative of a real creature, one that's currently unknown to modern science. So Green embarked on an extensive project cataloging as many Sasquatch sightings as he could find. This database became his lifelong quest and ultimately the back catalog for the Bigfoot Field Research Organization in 1995. That is still online. You can go there today. You can pick a region, you can pick a state, and then a region in that state and see the history of all of the Sasquatch sightings that have occurred there.
Really?
Yes, you can.
Oh, I want to do that.
It's really cool. Yep.
Awesome.
Do you want? We could do it for where you grew up, real quick. Actually.
Yeah.
Sightings by region, and then we're gonna pick New York State, and then let's see. In your county, the most recent sighting that they have on record is June of 2019. That was a Class A sighting.
Class A.
An afternoon sighting by a dog walker. The oldest sighting from that region is January of 1981, also a Class A. Man has clear sighting of a bipedal primate on a clear winter night.
Well, that's very cool. All right.
Yeah, so check it out. Bigfoot Research Organization. Go there, you can pick your state, and then you can see all the ones that occurred nearby.
Fun.
Green was working on building this catalog when he caught wind of a singular encounter. A man who had been kidnapped by a Sasquatch and lived with them for almost a week. Albert Ostman was a Canadian prospector who worked on logging crews for money while spending his free time hunting for precious minerals in the wilderness. An outdoorsman to his core, Ostman fit perfectly with the loggers and road crews who were there at that time. He had no issues taking extended camping trips, and he was very, very capable of surviving in the wilderness all on his own. Born in Sweden in 1891, Ostman ended up in British Columbia at some point during the early 20th century. We don't really know. The history wasn't logged all that well at that time. He spent his time working and enjoying the outdoors and prospecting whenever he could. He became enamored with stories of lost gold mines. You know anything about these like Western gold mines and these lost stories that they talk about?
I don't know about a lost gold mine. How do you lose a gold mine? They don't really go anywhere.
The idea here being that somebody, you're an outdoor person, you're hiking through the region and you come across a gold mine and you don't tell anybody about it.
Of course not.
Because why would you, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's just dumb. Yeah. So then you have this gold mine, but there are all these tales of like, oh, so-and-so knows where a gold mine is out there. The most famous of these is probably Pitt's gold mine, Ever heard of this before?
Nope.
Probably not. Okay. Which is supposedly located somewhere in the region of Pitt Lake, British Columbia. A popular urban legend during the early 1900s, Pitt's gold mine popped up in the news when a prospector named Slomak claimed to have found a gold deposit in a stream bed. Okay? Now, Slomak himself was a Katzie, a First Nations tribe from British Columbia. He was convicted of murdering a fisherman in 1891 and was hanged after being baptized.
Oh, damn.
Allegedly, Slomak's dying words were something to the effect of, "When I die, the location of the gold dies with me." So all of these rumors about uncovered gold kind of cropped up after his death. Very likely hearsay. Like, probably didn't exist. If anything, it was probably a way of him trying to get out of being hanged.
Don't blame him.
Why not, right?
Yep.
Yeah. But for the next 20 or 30 years, intrepid individuals started hunting the region looking for this gold mine. And it's likely that the entire story, except for the hanging, was made up as a way of drawing prospectors and providing jobs for local guides. That's sort of the assumption these days. But that didn't stop Ostman from trying his hand at finding it. And there was a good precedent for this too. The Klondike Gold Rush in the 1800s saw almost 100,000 prospectors flock to the Yukon in search of their fortune. Boom towns exploded and businesses along with them. And that wild, untapped wilderness of the North started to see the first developed towns and cities as these people strove to find their fortune in riverbeds.
This is like all the time of like Jack London, right? I feel like Jack London is like very deep into this world.
Is Jack London like the 1920s though?
Yeah, but I think he talks about those times.
Oh yeah, no, this would absolutely, yeah, this is totally Jack London. Okay. For sure, yeah. Yeah, that's the type of wilderness that you're talking about. Yeah, this is your White Fang, your Call of the Wild.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
Okay.
Now, Ostman had heard rumors about a gold mine or strike around the Toba Inlet of British Columbia. And it's worth pointing out that British Columbia is a massive province. It has an area of over 360 square miles. The Toba Inlet is close to Harrison Hot Springs, which is to say that it's less than 200 miles from Harrison Hot Springs. When we're talking British Columbia miles, that's close.
It's close, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's not close to me. Close to me is like 20 miles.
Right. It's very different up here.
Yeah.
Even in the Southwest, it's like everything's so far apart.
Well, yeah, like, in Texas and stuff, people are like, oh, yeah, we just go do that. In the Southwest, you're like, oh, yeah, we'll drive 100 miles. That's fine. But,
I know, it's crazy.
But yeah, here, if you have to cross a freeway, I'm like, ugh.
I know, exactly. God damn it.
So Ostman started off his expedition in Lund, a minuscule village on the Strait of Georgia. There, he hired an indigenous guide to help him find this alleged gold strike. And, as luck would have it, the guide he found actually knew someone who'd been there before. In fact, the guide said, the white man he knew went back multiple times and always returned with more gold. You're making a face like you don't believe that guide.
I don't believe this. I don't think this is going to end well.
It's such a thing. Like, so he's in this village and he's looking for a guide, and there's a guy that's like, oh yeah, I know where that gold strike is. I guided a guy there. He kept coming back with more and more gold. Yeah, I'll take you there. Sure.
Just sucker born every minute, man.
And then Ostman asked, what became of this guy? And the guide shook his head and said, one day he was out prospecting and he never came back. Local rumors claimed that he was caught and killed by a Sasquatch.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ostman wasn't familiar with the word Sasquatch, and so he asked the guide to elaborate. And the guide said, they have hair all over their bodies, but they are not animals. They are people. Big people living up in the mountains. My uncle saw tracks of one that were 2 feet long. One old Indian saw one over 8 feet tall. There are not many, but they still exist.
And again, what decade is all this happening?
John Green is learning about this in the 50s.
Okay.
But Ostman is recalling when this happened to him in the 1920s.
That's interesting because that predates the newer Bigfoot look.
Yes, it does.
But this fellow here is saying, right? Like it more fits the description of what we have now.
So this fellow is giving a description that fits the Sasquatch that we have now.
Yes.
Correct. That's because everything that I'm reading here, this whole account, is what Albert Ostman told John Green in 1958.
So it's being filtered through the modern knowledge of what people think they look like.
Exactly.
Okay. So who knows what he really said, basically.
And who knows if he even really existed.
Right. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. This could all be made up by this guy Ostman.
Yeah. This, of course, seems like a bit like the Pacific Northwest Zunukwa or the Bookwoos, you know? Ostman's unnamed guide even went out of his way to clarify that the Sasquatch is human, not an animal. He specifically says that. They are not animals, they are people.
Oh.
For his part, Ostman dismissed the story as bullshit, and the two of them set off into the wilderness. The guide set up Ostman at the mouth of a creek, had dinner with him, and left him there. Now, Ostman intended to spend the next 3 weeks searching the area. And like I said, he was a perfectly capable outdoorsman with a full accompaniment of provisions. You know, to him, this is like a fun vacation in the wilderness. This is not, and he is absolutely capable of living like this. Like he talks about how he goes out and he shot a deer and he was, you know, eating the deer meat and collecting stuff, and he had all his other provisions, like living his little alone lifestyle there. And civilization wasn't too far away either. His second day, he hiked into Lund for supplies at the general store. And among these supplies he got were canned goods, 3 rolls of snuff or chewing tobacco, and 2 boxes of rifle shells. And all of this got packed into a biscuit tin to keep it dry. Now properly equipped, Ostman set out on his expedition. He hiked for a few days, camping as he went, always unsuccessful in his search for gold. About a week into his 3-week vacation, he made a permanent camp under a cypress tree near a spring. And that's where he shot his deer and started, you know, harvesting the meat that he's going to need for basically the whole time. He figured, I got this deer, this will take care of me. When the deer meat runs out, I'll head back. Essentially, at this point, everything's going according to his plan. One morning, Ostman woke up and found that his camp had been disturbed during the night. He doesn't really go into detail, but says that nothing was missing. It just seems like things were kind of moved around. He always hung his food in a sack to keep it away from animals, and that hanging sack was undisturbed. So he figured, you know, it's probably just porcupines is what he thinks, is porcupines. And he decided to sleep with a loaded rifle in his sleeping bag that night, just in case. Which terrifies me, but he was okay with.
I would find a way to roll over and blow my head off.
He also put his shoes in the bottom of his sleeping bag because, as he says, porkies like leather. Oh,
interesting. That's a good little tip.
Yeah, porcupines like leather.
Another thing is just keep your shoes with you.
Yeah. Well, and it's going to become very important shortly that he did keep his shoes with him. The next morning, Ostman's food sack, the one that's been hanging from the tree, had been emptied all over the camp. This time, he was missing some dried prunes and some flour. His salt was untouched, which puzzled him because porkies always look for salt, as he said. I guess presumably to season the leather of their shoes. Obviously, Ostman's first thought is...
a porcupine? I don't know.
No, a bear.
Oh, a bear. Yeah. Oh, I see. He's looking for something.
Sack.
I got you. Yeah.
Yeah, he thought it was a bear. But he said that the mess at the camp was almost systematic. It wasn't like a bear was rooting around.
Okay, yeah.
And he couldn't seem to find any bear tracks at camp. So the whole thing left him very perplexed. And he's now really intent on seeing this uninvited guest with his own eyes. So he sat up in his tent that night with his rifle. Or he intended to. Instead, he quickly fell asleep and got a very rude awakening. Something picked up his sleeping bag and carried him away. So whatever it was, it grabbed the bag at the top, like grabbed the opening of the sleeping bag, lifted it up, shutting off the opening, and held Ostman aloft in the air.
He didn't have his gun anymore?
Oh, it's in the bag with him. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yep. He said he was awakened by the movement and first thought he was caught in an avalanche because he was like suspended, and then realized that he was being carried. He was basically thrown over the shoulder of something and then walked around for a little while and then dragged for miles.
How long was he carried?
Well, he didn't actually know.
Okay.
A long time. Due to his position and the cramped confines of the sleeping bag, he's trapped in there, right? Wrapped up, completely unable to move. He had his rifle, because he'd been sleeping with it, and he had his knife, but he couldn't reach his knife because he's all like confined and
okay.
tight. He also had a bag of canned food, which he said dug uncomfortably into his back throughout the journey. And luckily his shoes were in the sleeping bag because he was afraid of the porkies, and they were crushing his feet and his toes with every bounce. They went uphill and they went downhill with the bagged Ostman sometimes carried over his shoulder, sometimes just dragged along the rocky ground.
Wow.
And he figured about 3 hours passed until the sleeping bag hit the ground with a thud and a rattle of cans, and he was finally free.
This is a great little story. This is adorable.
So he scrambles out of his sleeping bag into the night air. His legs are numb because they've basically been in the same position for 3 hours. And he found himself in a terrifying situation because surrounding him were 4 Sasquatches.
Great.
He described them like this. They looked like a family. An old man, an old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. The boy and girl seemed to be scared of me. The old lady did not seem too pleased about what the old man dragged home. But the old man was waving his arms and telling them all what he had in mind.
Oh, so he could speak Sasquatch too?
No, it's just... we'll talk about it, but they talk in kind of a language that he can't really understand.
Okay.
And he tries to communicate with them, and they try to communicate with him, but it doesn't work really well.
Okay, all right.
So Ostman describes their anatomy in the kind of detail that makes you think this story is about to veer into Chuck Tingle territory. The old lady could have been anything between 40 and 70 years old. She had wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. Terrible insult, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Not built for beauty or speed. She's fat and ugly is basically what he said.
Yeah.
Some of those lovable brasiers and uplifts would have been a great improvement on her looks and figure.
Whoa.
The old man must have been near 8 feet tall, big barrel chest and big hump on his back. Powerful shoulders, his biceps on upper arm were enormous and tapered down to his elbows. His forearms were longer than common people have, well proportioned. The young fellow might have been between 11 and 18 years old and about 7 feet tall and might weigh about 300 pounds. The young girl would not hurt anybody. Her chest was flat like a boy's, no development like young ladies'. I am sure that if I could get the old man out of the way, I could easily have brought this girl out with me to civilization.
Wow. So he wants to steal one of them after he's been stolen.
Yeah,
Okay.
Chuck Tingle territory here, right?
God, that's so weird.
It's
Okay.
so weird. Well, this whole story is so fucking bizarre.
This is bananas. Okay.
And remember, okay, so John Green is listening to this old prospector. He actually wrote up this very, very long story. Mm-hmm. And John Green also interviewed him too. So you're listening to this guy go on about this.
Right.
Ostman listened to the Sasquatches talk to each other in this chittering language that they have. He tried to ask them what they wanted with him, but neither side could really understand what the other one was saying. And so after a brief standoff, Ostman felt reasonably confident that the Sasquatch family didn't mean him any immediate harm. They weren't trying to like eat him or something. Mm-hmm. And so he took stock of what provisions he had and where he was. He'd been left with only what was in his sleeping bag. His compass, luckily, was on a string around his neck. And this is something that I didn't think about until I actually read this story, but holy shit, is that important, right?
To have a compass around your neck?
Yeah, like on your person all the time. Not like in a pocket, but like on your neck. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, for real.
He still had his cans of food and coffee and one box of rifle shells.
How?
Because
did he sleep with this shit?
Apparently this shit was all in his sleeping bag.
This is the most suspicious thing I've heard.
Well, and this is the weird thing, right? Because his camp was being ransacked. We know that he hung his provisions. Yeah. We know that he was afraid of the porcupines or a bear or something like that. But then he stuffed a bunch of his provisions into his sleeping bag.
Mm-hmm. They were canned, but I imagine wild animals would still be able to would still get into cans, right?
I believe... And maybe our listeners can confirm this for me, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com. But I believe that a bear can still smell and get into a can. I don't think having a canned food is any real deterrent for a bear.
I don't think so, because they say, like, they can get into cars.
Yeah, you're not supposed to leave anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that a bear's sense of smell is very, very strong. So I think they can smell the food inside the can.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just too suspicious to me that he had too many really necessary items with him.
Also, how big is this fucking sleeping bag? He's already got a rifle in it. And he's got all this other shit, too?
We should take all that stuff and put it in our own sleeping bag.
Oh, we should do that.
And see how easy that is to sleep with.
Yeah, we should do that. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, sleeping with a compass around your neck.
I don't think that's that hard to do.
But you don't need a compass in the middle of the night.
Yeah, but it makes sense because you never know when you might be carried off by a Sasquatch.
That's a good point.
Also, admittedly, he was initially thinking that he was in an avalanche. So where he was camping, obviously avalanches were a possibility. And it does make sense, if you were suddenly caught up in an avalanche, I guess you would want as much with you as possible.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, in that case, I completely understand why he slept with all that stuff.
Yeah.
If you think an avalanche is going to come.
Totally. Now it's definitely real.
Now it's real. Forget it. Now I believe the whole thing.
He had 6 matches left, but he was also, he was perfectly capable of starting a fire without them. Like, he can do it. He can do the rubbing sticks together stuff. It's fine. Everything else, including his pots, pans, utensils, that's all left back at camp. As the Sasquatches continued their conversation with each other, Ostman hunted around this area. So they had brought him into a valley or a basin to a rocky overhang where the Sasquatches apparently made their den. So they have like a little cave, not like a super deep cave, but a little overhang cave. They slept on the mossy ground with blankets made out of woven cedar bark. So they actually made blankets for themselves. A nearby spring provided the family with water, and Ostman emptied his coffee can into a towel and filled that with spring water so he could drink. Over the next few days, Ostman, who's remarkably calm given the situation that he's suddenly in, makes friends with the younger Sasquatches. He gave them one of his snuff boxes to play with, and they enjoyed opening and closing it. It's got the little slidey lid,
yeah.
So like, oh, cool. The older Sasquatch, the old man, was unimpressed, probably thinking that his kids had a couple screw looses if a box was fascinating to them. When the prospector tried to leave, the adult male Sasquatch stopped him by putting up his arms and yelling, "Soka, Soka!" Ostman was concerned that his .30-30 rifle might not be powerful enough to bring down this Sasquatch. And he realized that he was a prisoner here until he could figure out a way to get out.
That's really fun. Okay. I don't understand this guy, though, this old Sasquatch.
What about him?
He brings this guy in.
Yeah.
For no reason.
Apparently, he just threw him on the ground and was like, part of our family now.
I know, and he doesn't even like Ostman.
No.
He doesn't like the things he brings his kids.
No.
But he won't let Ostman
But he won't
leave.
let him leave either.
So what is the point of this man unless he's like a toy for his kids?
And maybe, but he doesn't seem all that happy that Ostman's spending time with the kids either.
Right.
It's really odd.
It's very strange.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what he thought he was going to get out of Ostman.
Ostman seems like he's a big disappointment.
The whole time the old Sasquatch just like sits with folded arms staring judgmentally at him.
I know.
Like, so you going to go to college or what?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I picked the wrong human. This guy's boring.
As a side note, by the way, the Cowlitz-Chehalis Dictionary, which was set up by the Cowlitz Indian tribe, has a comprehensive list of words, phrases, and pronunciations from their native language. It should come as no surprise that the word soka does not have a direct translation.
Oh.
All that proves, of course, is that Ostman either misheard a phrase or was not captured by a rogue family of the Chehalis people.
So was it ever a thought that he was captured by people?
I'm just saying that they clearly weren't people.
No, I mean, he's saying they were apes.
Yeah, something.
Something.
It's also worth remembering that the school teacher, J.W. Burns, claimed that the Sasquatch had their own language. So they may be speaking their language here, and Soka may be a Sasquatch word. Mm-hmm. In the intervening years, since Green logged Ostman's account, opinions have shifted somewhat on Sasquatch vocalization. These days, these Squatch hunters will go out in the woods and they'll make like hoots and grunts and other kind of weird noises as if they're attracting a wild animal, but they never try to communicate through any form of language. The general cryptozoological sense is that Sasquatches don't have a developed language like humans do and communicate more like apes. So, that detail of this story is inaccurate. The only detail so far.
Yeah. I love how we're basing the details on more crazy details.
But it is important though, because if this was super consistent with part of the Sasquatch mythology, then we could maybe say, okay, we can use this as a basis to determine Sasquatch behavior. I mean, this guy was there for 6 days. You know, if these details checked out with other details that other researchers have put forth, then we could be like, okay, this can be a foundation. It can be a jumping off point. But this story is crazy.
It truly is.
And doesn't make sense. And therefore, we're going to see is completely inaccurate. It's fascinating to see Ostman boldly claim that his Sasquatches actually spoke to each other and tried to communicate through this developed language. It all highlights how Ostman's encounter, or at least his story about it, was colored by things like the indigenous mythology rather than the more modern Sasquatch research. There's no doubt that if he had been recounting those events today, these Sasquatches would have communicated through grunts and growls, not this unknown language. Ostman remained with the Sasquatches for days, watching them forage for food and entertain themselves by climbing trees and rocks and just jumping around. He knew he couldn't stay with them indefinitely, but the male elder didn't seem too keen on him leaving. Other than that, I mean, the family didn't try to harm him or like do anything with him or to him, but they also didn't offer him any food or shelter either.
Oh, he didn't get to stay in their cave with them?
No, he just had to camp out on the ground.
Wow, he's like their dog.
Oh my god, that's actually kind of what it is. Like,
he was their pet.
Yeah, the Sasquatch brought him back and like, follow me home.
Yeah. Or it's like, you know, you find a cute little animal and then you take it with you and you give it to your kids.
Yeah.
It's something for his kids to play with.
Yeah, totally. That actually kind of is what it is. You're right.
Yeah.
The adult male Sasquatch seemed very interested in Ostman's tobacco, and he hatched a plan to use that to escape. Are you ready for this?
I'm so ready.
Okay. On the 6th day with the Sasquatches, Ostman brewed a very, very strong pot of coffee. Then he made a big production of drinking it and pretended that it was like, oh God, it's so delicious. This is so good. So good. This is like $10 at Starbucks good, right? Then he took a pinch of chewing tobacco and gave the same production over it, like it was just a feast for his senses. Like, oh yeah, this is the best thing ever. Intrigued, The adult male Sasquatch approached him and inspected the snuff box. Curiously, it emptied the entire thing into its mouth and swallowed. So like a whole box worth of chewing tobacco, it just like downed, right? And almost immediately regretted that decision. With a belly full of tobacco, the Sasquatch obviously felt very, very sick. Which reminds me kind of the time that I smoked a cigar in like 10 minutes and then immediately felt terrible.
Yeah, and on top of that, you had Jameson.
Yeah, well, that was a whole other problem.
Oh man, that was just such a bad night. Oh man.
So this poor Sasquatch, now belly full of tobacco, feeling ill, it grabbed Ostman's coffee and downed that too, which only exacerbated the queasiness.
Oh my god.
Panicked, and it fled for the nearby spring to cleanse its palate with water. And Ostman saw his chance. Throwing his remaining supplies into his sleeping bag, he snatched up his rifle and bolted for the entrance to the valley. The adult female Sasquatch chased after him, but he fired his rifle over her head, hitting the rocks behind her. Freaked out by the gunshot, she hid in the cave and allowed Ostman to escape. He fled for 3 miles straight into the woods before stopping to rest. Although he'd been transported far from his camp, he'd had almost a week to inspect his surroundings and remember the details of the journey that he took inside the sleeping bag.
Wow.
Thinking he had a pretty good sense of what direction to go, he started off back toward civilization. After camping a night at a creek bed, he continued up the top of the highest mountain he could find, which turned out to be Mount Baker, right on the Alberta border and part of Banff National Park. 2 hours later, he heard a motor and followed the sound to a group of loggers. And getting there, I mean, remember, this is a logging camp, right? So these gruff guys, right? He was a little unwilling to share his experience with them and be like, I was just living with Sasquatch for 6 days.
Yeah.
So he told them simply that he was a lost prospector, and they helped him get back to Vancouver. And according to him, he never went prospecting again.
And then he tells John Green. Now, does he make money off of this story?
Oh, you're looking for reasons that he did this?
Yeah.
I don't think Ostman made any money off this story directly.
Okay.
But can you think of another reason why he might tell a story like this?
I don't know, to keep people from going to that area where there's gold?
Uh-huh.
Do you think he found gold there?
No, I don't think so. But I think that if any of it is true and it's not just something that he made up for fun, right? Because again, he was another one of these guys who was part of the logging camps, part of the construction in that area, Yeah. If it's a true story, yeah, I think that he probably was trying to protect an area that he thought was a good chance of being a gold strike. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, John Green, our resident Sasquatch researcher, heard Ostman on a news program in 1958. And according to the reformed prospector, he'd had the encounter 20 years prior in 1924. Green very eagerly contacted Ostman and met him once. By this point, Ostman had written up his story as a lengthy essay, which Green published in his book, Sasquatch, Apes Among Us. It's worth noting that Ostman's experiences dovetail very nicely with the stories of the bookwoos from indigenous folklore. Wild men and women living lives of solitude away from society. They even transported Ostman to their own version of the spirit world, a ravine and a rocky outcropping miles from civilization. It's likely that Ostman knew these folk tales and used them as a basis for his own account. After all, his indigenous guide even cautioned him about them before taking him into the woods. Again, assuming that you take all of this at face value.
Right.
Ostman died in 1975 at the age of 82. He's buried in the Fort Langley Cemetery in Vancouver. Subsequent expeditions through Banff and over Mount Baker were unable to find the valley where he'd claimed he'd been taken, or any evidence of the Sasquatch family who held him captive for nearly a week. At the end of the day, it's hard to know what to make of this story.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, except it was just the way to keep people away from the gold.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think, yeah.
Did he go back to it after that? And
We don't. He claimed that he never went prospecting again, which is exactly the kind of thing you would say if you were going prospecting secretly.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can tell you that John Green was struck by Ostman's blunt honesty. The prospector didn't seem to have any real interest in lying. Details of his life are scant, but we know that he was interested in the supposed lost gold strikes in the Canadian wilderness. And it seems like he never found one himself, but like I said, he probably wanted to keep potential competition away. The same way that anglers keep a secret fishing hole and you don't talk about it. I've had this happen with a couple of people that I've talked about, and I don't really care, but I've heard people be like, oh yeah, I have this thing. So yeah, they're just kind of very cagey about it.
Oh yeah,
It's
I've run
funny.
into that too. Like, oh yeah, don't go, or you just say, yeah, don't go down that bend of the river. That's where the Mothman hangs out.
Yeah, exactly. It's possible that he fabricated that story just to make the area appear dangerous to anyone who might wander there,
Yeah.
It's not that dissimilar from the yarns that Ray Wallace was spinning about this giant monster stalking around his expensive timber equipment. Ostman's story is the same. A tall tale of the fury of nature that will be released if you step outside the comforts of civilization. For what it's worth, Rene Dahinden and John Green distanced themselves from Ostman after his death. In a speech given at the China Flats Museum in 2003, Green said, "I have my own cross to bear, the Albert Ostman story. Albert was a very believable fellow who handled tough cross-examination with cheerful composure, swore to his story without hesitation, and stuck with it until he died. But I wouldn't believe him if he were telling it today."
Interesting. I wonder what changed.
I think just time.
Yeah.
Also, this is where there's a divergence, right? Because John Green, this is 58, and John Green is diverging into this. No, it's probably a primate. It's not human. And there are so many details of the Ostman story that are human. They have language. They have these like woven beds.
Yeah.
They're just living in kind of a primitive human type of environment. But Green is headed down this animal track.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't fit with the mythology that Green is building anymore. So that's the story of Ostman. And that brings us to about the 1960s. Now, Rene Dahinden, for his part, spent the rest of his life continuing to search for Sasquatches. He was, in his own words, completely unsuccessful. Never one to miss the opportunity for a joke, Dahinden appeared in a 1997 ad for Kokanee beer. The ad shows Dahinden giving an oblivious interview as a Sasquatch steals a case of beer from his trailer.
It's a great
It's
commercial.
wonderful. On April 18th, 2001, Rene Dahinden died. He'd been battling prostate cancer for 2 years. He was 71. Despite his best efforts, he'd never had an encounter with a Sasquatch. In his obituary, a friend recalled him saying, "I've spent over 40 years and I didn't find it. I guess that's got to say something."
Poor guy.
Yeah.
Seemed like he wasn't in any kind of denial, though. It seems like he was like, well, I guess there's no Sasquatch.
I mean, he spent 40 years, dude.
Yeah, I
know?
mean, and if anyone's going to find it, it should be Rene Dahinden.
He was the guy who was really out there. I always
Yeah.
love, he shows up in Harrison Hot Springs, walks into John Green's office. He's like, "Where's your Sasquatch?" Green's like, "There is no Sasquatch." And Dahinden's like, "Yeah, there is. I'm going." And then he just went and started expeditions for it.
Yeah.
He didn't have time to fuck around with any of that shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what, though? I really don't think he wasted his life, and I don't think he thinks he did, but I hope he doesn't, because I think that, to go, even if it's not real, even if there's nothing out there, what a fun, fucking cool life. Much more fun than my life. I mean, this guy's out there in the wilderness, which is, I kind of wish I had a life like that, like just going out into the wilderness on expeditions and exploring. And I mean, I'm just so envious of that life. And it doesn't matter if you're searching for, El Dorado or a Sasquatch or, ants. You're studying ants
So
or
cool,
studying,
man.
It doesn't matter what you're
Yeah.
doing. Like, you're out there. And I think that is such a cool life. So he had a very nice life, I think.
And I think he did enjoy it.
Yeah.
Everything I read about him, he just seems like he was a funny guy. He had a very kind of not dry exactly, but he was just a very deadpan sense of humor and stuff. And I don't know, he just seemed like he was a really great guy. Everybody who writes about him talks about how wonderful of a person he was. So yeah. John Green was elected the mayor of Harrison Hot Springs in 1963. While serving his community, he also presided over the World Championship Sand Sculpture Competition, hosted on the beach at Harrison Lake. In 1972, he sold his newspaper to devote more time to his Sasquatch research. By then, he'd logged over 40 reports of the creature, and more kept piling up. Green's research took him all the way into the 21st century. He published a library of Sasquatch books, gave lectures, and continued to investigate sightings as long as he could. Despite his decades of search, he, too, never had an encounter with a Sasquatch.
God, that makes me so sad for him.
Not a single one. But he would never say that this was a life wasted.
He lived his passion.
Yep,
and I think that is such a beautiful thing, man. Even if it's not based in anything, and even if he didn't come up with anything. It makes me think of ghost researchers who have seen ghosts. Like, they think they've seen ghosts, and they devote their lives to ghost hunting.
Absolutely, yeah.
But these poor fucking guys never saw the thing that they devoted their life to find.
Yeah.
And that makes me sad.
John Green died on May 16th, 2016, at the age of 89. Lauren Coleman, the founder of the International Museum of Cryptozoology, wrote, "The field of Sasquatch studies would have an entirely different personality if it were not for the gentle giant named John Green."
Aww.
So where does that leave Sasquatch? And what do these initial encounters tell us about the presumed behavior of Sasquatch, if anything? If we unpack the prehistory of Sasquatch encounters, here's what we find. We have stories of wild people, often taken from either pre-Christian mythology or indigenous folklore. These origins both follow the boogeyman concept so commonly found in similar stories. These creatures have a mystical power, and they ally themselves with other fanciful monsters that are even less believable. Searching for Sasquatch in these folk tales is merely backwards thinking and cherry picking, often with an ignorant or downright racist lens. Speaking of racist lens, we have stories that J.W. Burns heard from his students and their families. But remember, he was teaching indigenous children how to reject their native culture. This created fertile ground for the push and pull of wild forest spirits and proper Christian citizens. Burns and his pupils had obvious justification for creating a mythology of monsters. It was what they were afraid of being in light of the social progresses that was forcing its way into their world. Then we have Jacko, the wild man found on the train tracks. That was obviously a newspaper fabrication based on the wild man mythology, since the people who tried to see Jacko found out he never actually existed. You have the Ruby Creek incident, where Jeannie Chapman and her children were attacked by a monster from the woods. But the biologist who investigated that incident said it was a bear, evidenced by the overstepped bear tracks. The Chapmans were indigenous, and so it's possible that they retrofitted the bestial creature emerging from the woods as a mythological monster from their own cultural folklore. This leads us to Rene Dahinden, who spent his entire life investigating but never encountered a Sasquatch. In the end, it seems like he concluded there's nothing out there to support the idea of it. John Green himself came to Sasquatch research after making a joke about it in his newspaper. The British Columbia's Centennial Sasquatch Hunt was a tongue-in-cheek exercise to get a laugh and drum up some money and start John Green's political career. No one took it seriously until they started retrofitting old stories and old mythology to make them align with the creature. You have Ray Wallace, a lumber baron so concerned about his livelihood and making a joke, that he faked monstrous footprints to keep interlopers away from his job sites. He thought the whole thing was so funny that he kept it up for decades, even after he retired, up until the day he died. You have Albert Ostman, a prospector, who claimed his own encounter with a confoundingly goofy family of Sasquatches. His story is so ridiculous that his contemporaries, Green included, wrote it off years later, also as a joke or a lie. It's likely Ostman was telling tales to protect his investment, just like Wallace. Mm-hmm. And then you have William Rowe, a perplexing one-off story about an encounter with a female Sasquatch. The Rowe story, while probably the most believable of the bunch and one of the most believable cryptozoological stories out there, it can't stand on its own without some kind of supporting evidence.
Yep.
And when I say that, I don't mean evidence for his story. I mean evidence of the Sasquatch itself. It would take about a decade for real evidence to hit the spotlight in the form of a 954 frame reel of 16 millimeter film shot in Bluff Creek, Washington. That, of course, was the Patterson-Gimlin film, and it brought Sasquatch into the spotlight, making it one of the most famous cryptids in the world. Obviously, that film is way too deep for us to cover in this series, and we will talk about it. But the important takeaway for this series is that it supported William Rowe's sighting all the way down to the breasts on the Sasquatch. For the first time, you had evidence. Because up until this point, there's nothing,
well,
really.
I mean, you have the footprints.
Sure.
To me, the footprints are just as good as the Robert Pattinson. Holy shit.
That's gonna happen. Get used to it.
It's gonna happen. I can't help it. It's
Patterson-Gimlin.
It's either Patterson-Gimlet or it's gonna be Robert Pattinson film.
I do like Patterson-Gimlet. So.
It's what it's gonna be.
I feel like we need to do a Patterson-Gimlin film and cast Robert Pattinson as Roger Patterson.
Yes. We need to confuse the fuck out of everybody. Yes. Yeah. I also think there needs to be I think the 90s really messed up by not having a live action like Saturday morning cartoon that is the Ostman story.
Oh, yeah.
You can just see like the opening credits of like, yep, this gold prospector.
Dude. And then it's all about his adventures. It's there's something about it that feels very Hanna-Barbera to me.
It does. It's like this man wakes up out of his sleeping bag and he's a pet. He's a Sasquatch pet. And it's like this nuclear family, which you always see in the 90s. You know, you got the two kids, the wife and the husband. And like, you know, they all have their own personalities. The husband's kind of checked out. He's like, here, play with this pet, I guess, you know.
Well, he's the worker.
Yeah, he's like, I brought this pet home for these kids. They can't relate to me. I can't relate to them. Maybe they'll love me because they're this pet. And then the pet, Albert Ostman, what's his name?
Albert Ostman.
Albert Ostman. He teaches them all to appreciate the little things and love each other again as a family. But he's always trying to escape. Yeah. And that's and you know, in the end,
that's we're gonna cut all of this because we're gonna pitch this.
This is a great story for a TV show.
Warner Brothers Animation, we're coming to you.
Yep.
Right now.
All that is to say that I think that the evidence of the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Yes.
Is as good as the big footprints.
Except for the fact that we know now that all of those footprints were hoaxed.
Okay. I think that the
Patterson-Gimlin? Yeah.
Yeah, is a hoax.
Yeah, I think so too. But we'll talk about that in the future. The thing is, like, that's the greatest piece of evidence that we have. Really, of Sasquatch. And even you talk to anybody today, you talk to any cryptid researcher today, they're going to say the same thing. That is the thing that everybody points to all the time. It's the definitive thing. But it's not enough to have a couple frames of video.
Nope.
Because if Sasquatches are real, they have to behave like real animals. So where are the nesting sites? Where are the bodies? Not just of them, but of their kills, if they're meat eaters or omnivores. Do they migrate? If so, where and when and why? And why is it that so many of these answers to these questions, as we've seen, conflict with one another? The whole field of Sasquatch research is a mess of self-contradictory evidence and opinions. I personally don't believe that there is a species of giant hairy primate living undiscovered in the woods. I believe that Sasquatch is a primal human creation, a folkloric tulpa, if you will, born from our own fears of the very real dangers of the wilderness. It's the thing lurking in your childhood closet at night, the monster hiding just outside your window. It's humans' innate fear of the unknown, the threatening regions that lurk just outside the safety of our lights and fires and technology. Wayne Suttles, an anthropology professor at Portland State University, said, "When we were little kids, we learned about strange creatures and monsters. And then as we grew up, we learned that they weren't real and we had to give them up. When we find one again, it's like finding your teddy bear in the attic."
Oh.
It's the aha moment, when you can point to your primitive fears and say, they were right all along. There is something out there. That is Sasquatch. And that is our prehistory of Sasquatch.
That is such a great quote.
I love it. Because amongst all of this, all of our technology, all of the progress that we've seen, Sasquatch enables us to have this, oh my God, the unknown is still frightening. There's still something there.
There's still something we don't know.
It's still that wild person. It is there. It's what we've talked about the whole time. It's out there. It's lurking there. There's something to be afraid of. As Wayne Suttles says, it is something from our childhood that's like, I remember what it was like to be afraid like that. And not like afraid, like petrified with fear, but just look into the dark corners and be like, oh, there could be something there.
It makes you feel young and alive again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it makes the world more interesting.
Absolutely. And that is why Rene Dahinden and John Green devoted their lives to this thing, dude. Because of that fire that you get from it.
Keeps you young.
Totally.
It really does.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's great. It gets people outside. Enjoy nature.
Go enjoy nature. Find a Sasquatch.
Yeah.
Don't enjoy too much nature, though. Nature is also very dangerous.
It is dangerous. There are real bears out there.
Yeah, there are real bears. I'm working on something with bears that's very, very horrific.
Yeah, that's coming down the pipe.
Yes, it is.
I guess I never realized that Bigfoot started off as like this green man puck sort of thing. Sort of. At least for the settlers.
I wouldn't say that it started that way necessarily, but it's just that all of these cultures have that type of iconic representation of the power, the mysteriousness of nature.
Yeah, you have the indigenous wild man in the woods, right? They had those.
Yep, the Zanuqua, the Bukwoos that we talked specifically about from the Chehalis folklore. And I mean, we only focused on the Pacific Northwest because that's the region that we're really talking about here. But I mean, it's true everywhere. Every culture in humanity has these like things lurking on the outside. And they are usually not great big monster, six-headed snake type things. They tend to have a human-esque type of creature that lives on the fringes. And I don't believe, and people will say, well, that's evidence that Sasquatch is a cross-cultural phenomena or whatever. And I don't believe that. I believe that that is just an easy enough icon to conjure up that it becomes ubiquitous.
It's just in our nature, I think, to fear the unknown. And when I think people fear things, they create stories out of that fear.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, we had the witch trials in Massachusetts, well, all up and down the East Coast, really, in the colonial times. But the woods were a very scary place. You weren't supposed to go into the woods because that's where all the witchcraft happened and the devil worshipping and all this stuff. And so I don't know. I just think that it's keeping people in line, keeping people organized and doing what they should be doing. And if you venture out, then you're doing dealings with the devil. You're doing dealings with the wild man. You're in touch with your wilder side.
For sure. Yeah.
It's just with all of us, all cultures.
And I mean, yeah, you hit on it there too. If you're talking about that colonial, well, it's actually a little pre-colonial.
Definitely pre-colonial.
A little pre-colonial. Yes. American Northeast type of region, that was your wild man. Yeah. It wasn't Pan, it wasn't Puck, it wasn't a Bookwoo, It was a witch. Yeah, it was the devil. The devil was out there in the woods, and you had to stay away from it. Yeah, right. Absolutely same thing, and that's what it is to me. That's what Sasquatch is to me. It's that representation of the dangerousness of nature.
Yeah, for sure. Cool, man.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you.
So that's our Sasquatch episode.
So that is our Sasquatch series. Yeah, we'll be coming back to Sasquatch soon. Soon. There's a lot. I mean, there's just tons. It's hard because so much of Sasquatch ends up being like, here's a photo, and then we just kind of talk about the photo, So you really have to kind of dig deep and find the stories for everything, which is what I'm working on doing. Obviously, Patterson-Gimlin is going to be a major, major investigation that we will do at some point. That if you thought this series is big, Patterson-Gimlin is going to be huge because there's a lot to talk about with Patterson-Gimlin, and there's a lot of like back and forth. It's fascinating. Oh, I can't even go into it. We can't do that. We can't do that. We can't go down there because I'll get into it and
we'll never end.
We'll never end. But yeah. Okay. Yeah, but there's going to be more that we're going to do on Sasquatches. There's a lot of other incidents that I've found with Sasquatch, and I'm just going to throw out there, we haven't even touched non-North American primates yet. I mean, the Yeti's right there. So we'll be tackling that at some point.
I can see a Yeti from my backyard.
You can see a Yeti from your backyard?
That was a Sarah Palin joke. It's right across the Bering Strait.
Are there what?
Well, the Himalayas. I mean, you got to look over and then way down.
I don't know. She was wrong no matter what, so it doesn't matter.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, everybody.
And we will catch you on the next series.
Yeah.
Be safe out there.
Bye.
Next time. You are standing at the mouth of a gaping pit. Below you, hidden beneath layers of earth, lies a treasure beyond your wildest dreams. But to get to it, you must solve a centuries-old riddle of cryptic clues, or join the other searchers who have lost their lives in the yawning depths. Thanks for listening to Slaying Monsters, the Paranormal History Podcast. If you like the podcast, there's a couple ways to show your support. You can tell your friends, you can leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform, or you can head over to slayingmonsterspodcast.com and click on the Support Us button to leave a donation. For questions, suggestions, and other feedback, reach out to us, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com, and stay up to date by following us on Instagram @slayingmonsterspodcast. Your support helps us grow, and we are truly grateful to have our listeners and community.